Hey everybody, it's Tom, and I'm coming up to you today to talk about the second essay work, small book by Paulo Freire within this volume, Education for Critical Consciousness. The last one being a review of the first text, which is Education as the Practice of Freedom, in which was articulated the need to construe the function of education as one which allows people to see their ability to engage and create the world as fundamental to their humanity, and how, as one becomes conscious of that capacity, the relationship which is exhibited between the individual and the society in which they find themselves is going to become transformed and hopefully fundamentally liberating. And that's sort of like the fundament, and all those themes get fleshed out, as I mentioned, more completely in the later work of Freire, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, to which we will be turning soon enough. But I just wanted, before I put up some videos on that work, to cover these two other ones. The second one is volume Extension or Communication, and then an article that he published, which deals with the notion of illiteracy and adult literacy, and how efforts to propagate adult literacy can be conjoined with this project of education as a practice of freedom, such as he outlined it in the first work. Now, in the second essay, Extension or Communication, what is going on? What is this question? What he's referring by the term extension are, and he's speaking in terms of Brazil, predominantly in the 60s and 70s, but is a notion which can be generalized to humanitarian outreach more broadly. He's talking about programs of agricultural extension where educated people drawing on agricultural technologies inherited from, say, scientific processes and the Enlightenment or what have you, go out into rural communities with the idea of extending to these people these different technologies, practices, methods, and so on and so forth. Which, first blush doesn't sound that bad, and the intentions behind it are, on occasion, actually quite sincere and laudable. However, because they are often realized with a less than full consciousness of what is implicit and how everything is framed by the notion of extension, they sometimes, rather than becoming genuinely beneficial, become instrumental in preserving and at times expanding an anti-dialogical and even oppressive climate. This is the argument which is forthcoming from Freire in this text, and the counterpoint to this attitude of extension is, as you can imagine, the attitude of communication. Now, before we turn to what he means by communication, we can look at what he means by what's problematic about extension. And he identifies the term as having sort of two major lines of deficit, one of which is sort of linguistic in quality. Actually, they both have a linguistic quality to them, but one pertains to the formal manner in which the verb to extend operates syntactically. That is, it's a transitive verb which takes both an object and an indirect object. So the subject, who is extending, has that which he is extending, in this case some sort of set of methodologies, to an indirect object who inherits that which he is extending, in this case, the rural community. So there's the subject, the object, and the indirect object. And that grammatical structure has essentially a univocal trajectory, a one-way street, as it were, where the recipients of what is being extended are conceived of more or less as passive static containers, and even that which is being relayed is seen as singular and static as well. So already we see within this the manner in which the verb extension itself operates a certain theory of knowledge and learning, which is problematic, especially in light of some of the themes we talked about in the last video, with the need to realize the fundamentally dynamic and dialectical nature of knowledge, something which is formed in the process of conversation and communication. Now, on top of this stratum of criticism, Freire also notes that the word extension itself has a certain associative field around it. He's drawing on kind of jargon within formal or scholarly logistics, but it's nevertheless a relatively straightforward sense which he is communicating here, where any given word has a sort of field of significance which connects it with other words as well, so that there's almost, to use my own language, a kind of feeling tone which is in itself instructive and drives how that term is used, in which contexts it tends to arise, and so forth, right? Some of the notions which he sort of identifies, and I can just go ahead and read a few of them right here, as associated with the notion of extension as a concept. Well, we already sort of touched on some of them. There's the notion of transmission, content, a recipient, etc. Apart from those terms which are connected with the syntax, there are other terms as well. There's the notion of delivering or deliverance, messianism, or the idea of the outsider coming in to save the community. There's a sense of dyad of superiority versus inferiority, mechanical transfer, and ultimately, in Freire's view, with which I'm obviously sympathetic, there's an attitude of invasiveness, cultural invasiveness, because these technologies, these methods cannot simply be sort of understood as related to the culture from which they're deriving in a modular fashion. If you are going to take in technologies from outside of one culture and implant them in another, it is virtually impossible not to, in that process, also admit elements of the invading culture, the transmitting culture, the delivering culture, which potentially negate the culture which is on the receiving end. So you sort of look at these two linguistic criticisms, you can then proceed beyond one's concerned only with the language to what that language says about the programs with which they are associated. And here we have what the sort of middle part of the book is concerned, the fashion in which there's a certain theory of education that is wrapped up in this language, in this conception of extensionality and of assistential. It's a rather awkward word, sorry, but he uses the word assistentialism. Assistentialism, right? The idea that we're going to help these people out. And now we see how this, applies not just to agricultural programs in 1960s, 1970s Brazil, but the whole notion of humanitarian outreach more generally. and how it becomes really a tool of imperialism and colonialism, so that rather than being bona fide helpful, they often serve to create a very difficult situation for the people who are supposed to be assisted or helped, right? And I don't really think I need to say too much by way of elaboration on that point here, because all of it is already more or less stated all but explicitly in how the concept of extension is criticized with regard to its linguistic qualities. But all of that will then transition into communication as being what should be the approach. So the idea is not to just shut down interface and interaction with people outside of your own community. That obviously is not what Freire is aiming to advocate here. The challenge is to create a sensibility and a dynamic and a culture which allows us to move beyond barriers of cultural separation, but in a way which is congenial, equitable, and respectful of the freedom of everybody involved. And this is not just rainbows and unicorns, it also connects to how knowledge and how real education actually happens. And in the third portion of this secondary text, second text in the volume, he fleshes this out with, I think he's drawing very heavily here on the tradition of phenomenology and also on certain notions or tropes that are in Hegel, maybe a little bit in Marx. But here he notes how objects, to truly learn about an object, is not simply to encounter it as something which is to be memorized or as a label or to be assimilated into some kind of algorithmic recollection. There's an openness in consciousness which allows it to arise more vitally. And in the space of that openness, what becomes apparent is that the sphere of genuine revelation or disclosure is a sphere of intersubjectivity, not mere subjectivity. What happens is that our engagement with the world is fundamentally a communal engagement and a linguistic engagement, meaning that it arises as a result of how we interact with each other. And the objects about which we're learning, whether that be agricultural technologies or mathematical proofs or the history of modern art or how to play bananagrams, whatever it is, the object is actually simply mediating, is secondary and facilitating of an encounter with the other person or the other persons involved. This is actually what Freire puts forth, how learning happens. And the requisites of that happening include, amongst other things, humility, love. There's a certain degree of critical rigor involved, which means that one can never be satisfied with a rigid formula in light of the dynamism both within the object itself, within reality at large, and within human relationships that serve to inform how consciousness is engaging the world and leading to a freedom which can conduce to the positive transformation of that world. And he spells this all out in Pedagogy the Oppressed in some detail. But nevertheless, this preliminary consideration that we have of it in extension or communication, really on its own 2 feet, I found quite striking. So I could only exhort you to seek it out and read it yourself, and engage, as it were, in your own process of appreciating, even if you don't ultimately come to accord with what he's suggesting, but appreciating that facet of experience which shows us that learning is, if you like, a public affair, not just something which occurs in the interiority of our consciousness, which is sort of the suggestion that we get from at least a vulgar Cartesianism that tends to be regnant in the public discourse. Well, I guess, I could wrap it up there, at least for today. And next video, I will turn to this notion of literacy. And there's going to probably be some thematic redundancy with what we've discussed so far, but repetition is not altogether our enemy at times. It can help to consolidate our relationship with what is disclosed. So hopefully this is of use to you guys, and I will catch you later. Ciao.